South Korea stands today as one of Asia's most vibrant economies. Known for its technological prowess, advanced manufacturing, pop culture, and high standard of living, the country has become a global force in a remarkably short time. But behind South Korea's tremendous growth, there is a less discussed but significant influence: the US military. Since the end of the Korean War, the United States has maintained a substantial military presence in South Korea. While primarily designed to deter aggression from North Korea and maintain security in the region, the US military's presence also functions as a steady economic engine for South Korea in multiple ways. But before we try to understand their economic impact in South Korea today, we must first understand the economic impact it brought in South Korea's history. The story of the US military in South Korea starts with the Korean War. At the time, the United States intervened to aid South Korea in repelling communist forces from the north. After an armistice halted open hostilities, roughly 28,000 US troops remained in South Korea. Over time, this presence became more structured under the auspices of the 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty between the two countries. Here's a graph on American aid programs to South Korea before 1951. Here you can see that these are roughly about $1 billion from 1945 to 1951. It may not really seem substantial, but $1 billion in 1951 was a massive amount of money, especially when adjusted for inflation. To put this into perspective, $1 billion in 1951 would be equivalent to over $10 billion today. In the immediate post-war period, the Republic of Korea was heavily reliant on US aid for reconstruction. Over time, economic assistance from organizations like the United States Agency for International Development played a role in helping rebuild infrastructure. However, starting in the 1960s and accelerating in the 1970s and 1980s, South Korea charted its own path toward industrialization, focusing on heavy and chemical industries. During this period, the US military presence offered steady streams of revenue for local communities around the bases, and it also facilitated the exchange of new technologies and skills. That is what makes US military presence in South Korea so important. They not only provide direct aid, but their soldiers in the ground need food to eat, which most likely would come from Korean farmers. The infrastructures that they would build would also help create jobs for normal Koreans, and so many benefits would directly head towards the people. Here's another graph on the US economic and military assistance from South Korea, but this time for the years between 1955 to 1967, data from the US aid. Here you can see that in these years, the Korean War has ended. But military aid continued to flow. This, as many people see, was crucial for the Korean economy to rebuild itself after the war. Here's another graph on the summary of the economic and military assistance to South Korea from the United States for the years from 1946 to 1976. Here you can see that it is indeed massive. In total, military assistance amounted to over $6.8 billion, while economic aid was over $5.7 billion. Together, they are over $12.5 billion. If we adjust this for inflation, it would roughly be around $90 billion in today's dollars, highlighting the sheer scale of the support provided by the United States to South Korea during this critical period. But what does this military assistance look like? Well, it could be broken down into several key components: infrastructure development, technological transfer, direct spending on goods and services, and regional stability, all of which contributed to South Korea's economic development. But one of the most important and probably most interesting for everyone to see is the list of US arms supplies to South Korea. Here's a list for that from the years 1950 to 1968, data from various sources. Here you can see that US arms supplies to South Korea ranged from advanced aircrafts like the Lockheed T-33A to the Northrop F-5B Freedom fighter. Now, the reason why this is important is because when the US supplies arms to South Korea, it would help deter any potential North Korean threats. Before we continue, a big thanks to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. Surfshark VPN is the perfect tool to secure your online presence and unlock the internet's full potential. Just as the US and South Korea's partnership reshaped economies, Surfshark reshapes your browsing experience by keeping your data private and providing access to global content without restrictions. Whether you're exploring history, streaming global shows, or staying informed on international news, Surfshark ensures your connection is safe, even on public Wi-Fi. With unlimited devices on one account, it's perfect for families, and their clean web feature blocks, ads, trackers, and phishing attempts, making your browsing smoother and safer. The best part? You get all these benefits for less than the cost of a coffee per month, plus a 30-day money-back guarantee. And right now, you can grab an exclusive deal at surfshark.com/BehindAsia and get 4 extra months free. So, whether you're diving into South Korea's economic story or just want a secure and open internet experience, Surfshark has you covered. Now, let's get back to our discussion. Now, what we've discussed so far is about the past. Indeed, the US military and the United States overall has provided a lot to the Korean economy over the years. What we want to know, however, is how big of an impact it brings today. US President Donald Trump has voiced concerns in the past about the financial burden of maintaining US troops overseas, including in South Korea. Trump frequently called for South Korea to increase its financial contributions to support the US military presence, arguing that the United States was shouldering an unfair share of the costs. Today, Trump is back in office, and there have been debates and speculation about whether he would reduce military spending in the Korean peninsula. This is what we want to know. What would happen if Trump did reduce military spending in South Korea? Would it actually be big enough to harm the Korean economy? Well, let's try to understand the economic impact the US military then brings to South Korea. The very thing we need to understand first is how many troop numbers there are in South Korea. Exact numbers vary year by year, but in general, according to the US Department of Defense, has around 28,000 to 30,000 active duty personnel stationed in South Korea. These troops are stationed across several major bases and installations, which serve as critical hubs for military operations, training, and regional stability. For instance, there is Camp Humphreys, Pyeongtaek, which is the largest US overseas military base in the world. Spanning over 3,500 acres, it serves as the headquarters for the United States Forces Korea. Then, there is the Osan Air Base, which plays a key role in maintaining air superiority and readiness in the face of potential threats from North Korea. Then, there's Camp Casey, Dongducheon, located near the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, and it is a key base for the US Army operations, hosting the 2nd Infantry Division. Each of these installations can be viewed as small cities of their own, providing housing, medical services, retail shops, recreational facilities, schools, and more. This microeconomy within bases naturally requires local goods and services, spurring commerce with South Korean vendors and contractors. In addition, there are thousands of American civilian employees and military contractors who also live and work in South Korea. This means the total population affiliated with the US military presence is often quoted at over 40,000 when including dependents, spouses, children, and civilian workers. The significance of this size cannot be understated. In comparison, outside of conflict zones, South Korea represents one of the largest concentrations of US forces abroad. This concentration has multiplied the direct and indirect economic benefits for the South Korean economy. So, how do they contribute directly? Well, one of the ways can be from construction and infrastructure development. Over the past decade, the United States and South Korea consolidated a number of smaller installations into the expanded Camp Humphreys in Pyeongtaek. This expansion project, which began in the early 2000s, has cost over $10.7 billion, although the cost is shouldered by both South Korea and the US government. But what's interesting about this infrastructure program is the fact that the new runways, barracks, schools, hospital facilities have been carried out by South Korean firms. These companies employ Korean workers, buy Korean materials, and pay taxes within Korea. The result is a huge boost in local employment and revenue for Korean businesses. Secondly, these US military bases would then procure a range of goods and services from local suppliers, from fresh produce for commissaries to technical equipment for maintenance. These purchases can be measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The cost of the entire thing, from salaries to military personnel, operations and maintenance, family housing construction and military construction, have varied year after year. But here's a graph from 2016 to 2019, data from the US Department of Defense. Here in the first graph that we will see is how much the DoD provided for both Japan and South Korea. For Japan, they had obligated $20.9 billion, and for South Korea, it was $13.4 billion. But the good part is that the Korean government has provided some form of payments. Data from the DoD shows that Japan provided $12.6 billion, and South Korea provided $5.8 billion from 2016 through 2019 in cash payments and in-kind financial support. In addition to direct financial support, Japan and South Korea provided indirect support, such as foregone rents on land and facilities used by US forces, as well as waived taxes. There are a lot of agreements for these. These are called the burden sharing agreements, commonly referred to as the Special Measures Agreement, which govern how much of the cost of stationing US troops in South Korea is covered by the host nation. Nevertheless, the US is actually still paying much more than the host nation, which is why Donald Trump previously has voiced strong criticism of these agreements, arguing that host nations like South Korea and Japan should pay a larger share of the costs associated with stationing US troops. Then, fourthly, one of the biggest economic impacts of these US military installations that extend to the start of the US-South Korean relationships can be the democratization of Korean politics. The military isn't really a tool for promoting democracy, but it is well known that the US effectively used it as leverage to advocate for human rights and democratic reforms. For example, President Carter threatened to withdraw US troops from South Korea unless the Seoul government made improvements in its human rights record. Similarly, the Reagan administration exerted significant pressure on the authoritarian Kun Du-hwan regime, discouraging the use of force against the 1987 democracy movement, a pivotal moment in South Korea's democratization. This influence was made possible, in part, by the presence of US troops stationed in South Korea. Finally, here's a graph on the Korean defense expenditure to GDP. Here, you can see that South Korea does indeed spend a lot of money in their defense every single year. But this isn't really the highest among advanced economies. For instance, here's a graph from the World Bank with dates on the latest available. Here you can see that the United States spends nearly a percentage more. Singapore also outspends South Korea. If we include other economies, we even get to see that there are a lot of other more out there that outspend South Korea. But you may already get it. It is the fact that if the United States had not been spending money, or sending their troops to South Korea, it would arguably force the Korean government to move their money from spending on infrastructure or education to spending on military. Put simply, the presence of US troops and the financial commitment of the United States to South Korea's defense effectively allows South Korea to allocate more resources toward domestic development. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.